Planet of the Apes versus Planet of the Apes versus Planet of the Apes.
You maniacs! You blew it up!
When comparing the Planet of the Apes films, one thing must be addressed. These films are not like each other. They take ideas and elements from the original source, but are then changed to fit the vision of those who are making the films. Let's first discuss how the Mark Wahlberg remake fits with the original. It takes more of the base 1968 film than the current reboot does, but it still changes a considerable amount. When we bring in the current films, Rise of the Planet of the Apes, it might bring some people to say that it has nothing to do with the Planet of the Apes series, and the only thing it has in common is that there are apes. Only, Rise is actually a bit more faithful to the ape source material than the Mark Wahlberg remake was. The original Planet of the Apes film had 4 sequels with increasingly complex plots. This is important because Rise of the Planet of the Apes is actually a remake of Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, which falls on the timeline as being the 4th film in the original series. Also, warning, considerable spoilers from this point forward. Not only am I going to ruin Planet of the Apes, but the remake of Planet of the Apes, and also Rise, and Conquest. So you've been warned. So what makes this so interesting is that it breaks from your traditional mold when comparing remakes to one another, which is basically a retelling of the same story, which is what the 2001 remake did. But Rise of the Planet of the Apes actually takes from another set of films and builds a new comprehensive world off the old foundation. Which, if you look at the original films, the potential to take all the wrong things would have been too easy. Rise is basically a retelling of Conquest, which is actually a sequel and a prequel to Planet of the Apes. In the film Escape from the Planet of the Apes, Cornelius and Zira use what they learned from Charlton Heston's spacecraft to flee the Earth and go back in time, because Charlton Heston's character blows up the Earth at the end of Beneath the Planet of the Apes.
Bloody bastard.
So basically in the process of fleeing back to that timeline, Zira and Cornelius have a child, but they're subsequently killed by the US military. But before that, they switch the child with a chimpanzee in the zoo. So their child survives that, and then this ties into the film Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. Basically, when Zira and Cornelius came back in time, they brought a virus with them that killed all the cats and dogs. And humans, still wanting pets, started to bring apes into the home, so the humans could train them to do all sorts of things, like household cleaning and dishes and things like that. So Caesar, being smarter than the average ape at the time, begins to organize the apes into a resistance, and Caesar plots a coup against the human masters. So Caesar is an ape from the future that through his actions brings about the Planet of the Apes. So that character in Conquest is a paradox, because he would only exist if he had come from the future, and if he hadn't come from the future, Planet of the Apes wouldn't necessarily have happened. Which is a neat story element, but I'm glad the new Rise film decided to go their own direction. However, in the Rise film there is mention of a spacecraft that goes missing. So there is still potential for a Planet of the Apes-like film later on, and also, depending on how they play it out, another time paradox, but I really don't think the new film's going to go that direction. Rise does the Caesar plotline differently. Caesar is the result of experimentations while trying to cure Alzheimer's, and it has an unintended result of making apes more intelligent, and also wiping out mankind with a retrovirus. Which, honestly, I love the new direction Planet of the Apes is going in cinemas, because this is technically a prequel to the primary events of the Planet of the Apes story we already know and love. So by taking parts of Conquest, they have made a very solid film. Even the battle sequence on the Golden Gate Bridge has reflections of the final battle in Conquest, which shows that the apes are capable of not just planning, but tactical planning. So to keep a long story short, the new Rise film saga falls on the timeline in comparison to Planet of the Apes, but the events take place before Planet of the Apes, among the prequel category, but is still effectively in the universe of Planet of the Apes. So making a direct comparison of these films, impossible. Now, after all that, let's talk about the 2001 film. Have you ever wondered why the 2001 film took the apes to a drastically less advanced point in comparison to the 1968 original? When the 2001 film was being pitched around Hollywood, the main idea was that it would be like Spartacus, only the apes were the Romans and the humans were the slaves that revolted. So from the very start of the film, it wants to capture the spectacle of an epic like Spartacus, with the revamped action of Gladiator. There were other pitches throughout the years, but none of them quite remained like the original 1980s pitch of being a gladiator spectacle. So this idea of Spartacus Planet of the Apes apparently bounced around since the mid-1980s before finally being picked up by Tim Burton and his creative team, which Burton and his folks had ideas of their own as well. With the film being a Tim Burton production, automatically the tone of this film would be drastically different from the original. When we compare both intros, we really get different approaches. The 2001 film starts with a chimpanzee in a space capsule, which it quickly loses control, and Mark Wahlberg's character comes out of nowhere to show them that it's a simulator. Then we find out this is a deep space research ship that has all kinds of animals on it for deep space experiments, which makes me wonder, why? Yes, we used primates in early spaceflight tests. We didn't let them fly the spacecraft, though. So this is an odd narrative choice. It's mentioned that the apes are genetically enhanced, but again, why? Even in 2001, we knew computers could fly things sometimes better than humans. Also, if a computer won't work in the place you're sending an ape, what are the odds the capsule will as well? So an interesting plot device, but I guess we'll see where this goes in the film. The original starts with Charlton Heston's character talking about their 6-month mission traveling at near the speed of light. Which is explained to have caused time to have slowed on the ship, but the time on Earth to have progressed about 700 years in their absence. So the mission they were on was drastically different than that of the 2001 remake. With the crew already expecting Earth to be different, but only they weren't expecting to be on Earth when they landed. So the ship crashes, and they discover that one of their hypersleep chambers was damaged and causing the crewmate to die in their sleep. So the 3 crewmates flee the ship and find themselves in the middle of a vast desert, which it takes them a bit of time before they actually run into any humans. Which, I honestly like how this is done. It shows that the world has a barren part to it, and a vast level of nothingness in between. The 2001 version of the film takes more time on the ship, and they find a disturbance in space, which happens to be an electromagnetic disturbance capturing pretty much all the radio waves from human history. So the Oberon decides to send an ape in to investigate the anomaly. However, this upsets Mark Wahlberg's character. So when the ape's pod gets lost, Mark Wahlberg goes in after it, looking for him against orders. So almost as soon as he enters the anomaly, he loses contact with the Oberon. And then his clock is shown to be jumping all over the place, with dates kind of going up and down at random. And at this point, the pacing of the 2001 remake drastically shifts from the original. Because almost as soon as Mark Wahlberg's character crashes on the planet, he immediately encounters humans, and shortly after that, the apes. What I think doesn't work here is how the apes in this film climb in the trees and start kind of capturing people. What made the apes so menacing in the original film was that they rode horses like humans and acted like the humans were nothing more than lowly game animals that they needed to force out of the field. And they did this with sticks that they were beating on the ground. So it almost made the humans seem like a non-threatening entity. So the 2001 film makes the apes something else. They're more of a spectacle than something that mirrors man's cruelness to lower creatures. So it doesn't come off quite as well to me. There's a clear difference in the sense that the apes in the 2001 remake rely on their strength to overpower mankind, as opposed to the ones in the 1968 original, where they use their intellect that basically made them a mirror of man and their ability to rule the world. So the first major difference between the films is that the humans in the remake can talk. And this completely derails it for me. So you're going to tell me that humans didn't go any further out and establish villages away from the apes? They know that the apes don't like water, so why not go to an island? It just kind of makes it hard for me to buy that the apes would have a mentality that they do in the 2001 film. because it's clear that the humans have intellect because they can talk and build tools. But what I just don't understand is how the humans hadn't collectively gotten together and built better weapons and equipment to combat the apes. But I mean, there could have been centuries of history that they left out about how the apes defeating a human empire of some sort. But I think that is almost a really interesting story that could have been shoehorned in to kind of build more lore for this world. But it's established rather quickly that the apes in the 2001 film don't care for humans in any way. The 1968 film has the humans as being dumb and unable to talk, in a switch of position between apes and humans in reality. The humans' inability to talk made working against the apes impossible, which the humans' lack of intelligence made it easy to understand why the apes would feel the way they do about humans. The remake isn't quite sure where it wants to go with the humans in this one, so the apes just use the humans like slaves. Which again, these humans aren't dumb like the ones in the original version, so what's to stop these humans from killing the apes in their sleep? It's not like the cages they're in are very good, as shown by our main character Mark Wahlberg escaping from his cell rather easily. So this is just another example of the kind of original Spartacus pitch kind of coming through. Where in the original, Charlton Heston's character is almost overwhelmed by their world, and his friends are killed, and one is actually lobotomized. Mark Wahlberg's character seems like he's kind of got it all figured out. So the great nervous scenes you get with Charlton Heston trying to make sense of the world he's currently in are kind of lost. Where Mark Wahlberg's scenes kind of come off more as someone who's just surprised that the world has shifted, but still has kind of this odd coolness about him. And one of my most divergent ideas of something I noticed about the new Planet of the Apes. There's a moment where the main enemy, General Thade, takes and holds open Mark Wahlberg's character's mouth and looks for the human soul. But one of the things he doesn't notice about Mark Wahlberg's mouth are the metal fillings. Something to observe about 2001 Planet of the Apes is that the apes live in a city-state style society. So meaning that they would have kind of a Roman-esque kind of diet. So typically, the more wealthy you were in that society, the worse your teeth would be. At least that was the case with the Roman Empire. So these apes with diets consisting of primarily fruits and kind of high sugars and things like that would odds are have really, really bad teeth. And this was also the case with Roman higher-ups. So it wouldn't be inconspicuous for Mark Wahlberg's character to have nice teeth because nomadic peoples, at least ones who live in those hunter-gatherer situations, wouldn't have access to high amounts of sugar, so their teeth would be pretty good. And that was kind of the case in the Roman era as well. But I think it's odd that General Thade didn't notice the metal fillings. The 1968 film and the 2001 remake begin to deviate from each other quite considerably when comparing the ape civilizations. The 1968 film shows a world of the apes as one not too far from civilization of the 19th century. It lets you use your imagination when it comes to how advanced they are. It appears we're also made aware that the apes had a former caste system that was based on the race of gorilla, orangutan, and chimpanzee, which kind of leads to greater world building. The 2001 remake, on the other hand, fails to mention a lot of that, and kind of just gives us an image of an ancient city-state style of government. The major narrative difference between the 2001 and 1968 film is that the society in the 1968 film is dogmatic and will hide the truth from its people in order to ensure that man is kept as a mere vermin. So the very idea of a man that talks is blasphemy. So the 1968 film draws allegories of how the Catholic Church would forcibly suppress any kind of thought that went against their major dogma. The 2001 film doesn't quite go into that. Instead, it has central antagonists that kind of go against the mold and try to ensure that ape society stays the way it is. But it doesn't really provide a lot of explanation or the same thing that they did for Dr. Seuss in the original. But I'll come back to comparing the central motivations for keeping ape society the way they are. Let's compare two scenes. The first is when Taylor takes a piece of paper to show that he's not a man like the others. This reveal was pretty intense because she was looking for a human who could talk, or try to teach one at least, but she hadn't found any until that moment. So a piece of paper saying, "My name is Taylor," absolutely opened her eyes, and the fact that Taylor was being beaten for trying to communicate with her made it all that more interesting. And also the idea that their society is ideologically opposed to the concept of a talking man, making him quite literally the boogeyman that their society warns of. The same scene in the remake has the humans being branded, and our main ape is against it and breaks in, only to be kind of threatened by Mark Wahlberg's character, where he talks to her saying, "Please help me." And what's kind of odd about this scene is she's kind of shocked by his directness with talking to her, but she knows humans can talk. So the scene doesn't quite come off the same way. So the impact of that moment is drastically lessened, and they kind of do a workaround in the film where she just simply says he's different, which doesn't quite have the same payoff that the other scene did. The 1968 version of the film made the humans mute and basically more like animals that were a pest. So it made it easy for the apes to justify their hatred of the humans. And in the remake, it's kind of hard to justify, because the humans can talk and organize themselves. This is the main difference. The remake is pretty heavy-handed in this, because it wants you to follow the same chain of thoughts they had in the original that was so hammered home by the hatred in Dr. Seuss. But the remake just doesn't have that kind of steam or hatred available to paint the story in that light. The original took its sweet time, and had a pretty great payoff for how they kind of put this all together. The logic in the remake was rather forced, and I think the film suffered for it. And now we've come back to the motivations of the bad guys. The main bad guy in the original was Dr. Seuss.
Dr. Seuss, Dr. Seuss, Dr. Seuss, Dr. Seuss, Dr. Seuss, oh, Dr. Seuss.
Who was the chief scientist and the defender of the faith, so his position put himself into a natural contradiction, which means he was in a position to hold society back, to defend the greater beliefs of ape civilization. General Thade's motivations in the remake are pretty weak, but again, not exactly weak, but it seems to come out of nowhere. Two gorillas show up and take him to a crash site, where then Thade snaps and kills them, which feels like it comes out of literally nowhere, just like the space pod from space. However, there is a scene after that where Thade meets with his father, who explains about the power of humans. I feel like the meeting with his father should have taken place before Thade murdered the two gorillas. It would have given his motivations more meaning and made it more clear that he was genuinely concerned about humans coming from the sky because of their past power. So for him to randomly murder two apes because of something that looked like a crash site, which, if he had lived in a city-state style civilization, he would have no concept of understanding of. I feel like his character is somewhat underdeveloped. His hatred of humans doesn't seem like enough of a motivator, at least to kill other apes over keeping some secret he doesn't necessarily understand. So ultimately, his motivations seem like that of a general wanting a large battle with humans, which is kind of exactly where he takes it, and I think that's a reflection of what the original pitch wanted, was just a gigantic battle. He's not written like Dr. Seuss, who believes in protecting the faith and society to the point of perpetuating ignorance. So Thade's character comes off as a bit more shallow, which in terms of world building isn't necessarily too bad. Where the 2001 remake kind of lost itself in the world building and didn't go into too much depth, it made up for it with just pure grandeur and the complexity of the costumes and makeup that they used. They were literally just gorgeous. And it has that definitely going for it. Where the original had a lot of really fun ideas, and they chose to do a bit more world building by putting these ideas out there and letting the audience kind of play with them. So they have two fundamental differences in that. The remake was more visual and like to show instead of tell you, where the original had the limitations of budget, even though it was a pretty expensive endeavor at the time, but they still couldn't show everything they wanted. So they had to give you these ideas and kind of let you run with it. The twist ending. The twist of the remake has a time travel element to it, with the Oberon coming back and looking for Mark Wahlberg, and essentially ending up in an earlier time, sparking the chain of events that would ultimately lead to the Planet of the Apes. Only what bugs me here is, it's clear this is another planet from this shot when Mark Wahlberg first comes through the anomaly. There's more than one moon. Where did the horses come from? I get that there were apes on the Oberon because they used them for various activities and piloting things, but where were the horses? But then after that point, the twist ending gets kind of odder, because Mark Wahlberg takes the pod once his old ape buddy shows up, and then he immediately blasts off to Earth, which, as soon as he arrives at Earth, he's immediately greeted by a large statue of a Lincoln Thade memorial. And sadly, this is never really explained. With the DVD release of the film, there's actually a little card you get that shows the various timelines and how it's possible someone beat him back to Earth. But it's just ultimately one of those things they put in, I think, because Tim Burton stated he would rather jump out a window than make another film. So we'll never quite really know where that story arc could have gone. The 1968 film has a very iconic twist, with Taylor having been on Earth this whole time, which is interesting, but I can't quite figure out why his ship would have gone back to Earth. when the mission was clearly about them going to a different solar system. But let me just say something. If you were going to a whole nother solar system, wouldn't you be a little more prepared than just 3 backpacks? I mean, it's one of those things where just whoever put this mission together just gave this stamp of approval on 3 backpacks. And kind of the weird part was that one of their crew members died, so there might have been a 4th backpack they could have taken with them into the desert with supplies in it. So they just kind of left that one out there. But yeah, just bad planning on their part. In conclusion, Planet of the Apes is a fun premise that translates well to film. The reboot shows that it's still a fun premise that sells tickets, and the stories are moving into a somewhat new territory that is more of what people want in a theater experience. The 1968 film will remain a classic because it basically pioneered some of the great parts of filmmaking. Its makeup basically led to the creation of the Oscars category for it. You're welcome, Suicide Squad. The 2001 remake is a fun film that I wouldn't say is bad, but it's not great either. But that could also be influenced by the 2 decades of development hell it existed in. But if it had gotten a sequel and they had expanded and explained where it had been going, I think that could have been a lot of fun. So it's just kind of a story that had a lot of potential that just ultimately didn't reach it because of all the decisions and things that went into its original creation. Hey, thanks for watching the Historic Nerd today. If you like this content, feel free to drop on my website, www.historicnerd.com, or if you want to talk to me directly, feel free to send me a message at Twitter or the Historic Nerd Facebook page, which I rarely update. Yeah. Have a great evening, day, or whatever it is you're doing. Bye.